Next, we have a panel focused on IoT and IoT certification, and moderating that panel is going to be Alex Spotting, my colleague from Venable, Alex Spotting. I'm going to pass things over to him now.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Ari, and good morning, good afternoon, in at least one case of our panelists, good night. So my name's Alex Spotting. I'll be moderating this panel on IoT security, and this has been a pretty active area for governments over the past 18 months, I think it's fair to say. And it's certainly been a topic on which the Cybersecurity Coalition has been actively engaged in helping to shape some of those proposals that have come out. Our hope for the discussion today is that beyond outlining what's been done by individual countries, we can start to draw out some themes, similarities, differences, and dare I say, outline what might be a path forward for a coordinated international approach to IoT security, which is critical not only to addressing the challenge itself, but particularly from a private sector perspective as we look at companies that operate across a number of markets. We've got a fantastic panel with which to do that. We've got Mr. Chia Lim, who's Director of Cybersecurity Engineering Center at the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. We have Kat Migas, who is Manager of the Cybersecurity for IoT program at NIST within the US Department of Commerce. We have Andreas Mitrakas, who's Head of Unit for Data Security and Standardization at ENISA, which is the EU Cybersecurity Agency. And finally, we have Peter Stevens, who is Head of Secure by Design at DCMS, which is the UK's Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, affectionately known as the Department of Fun by a number of folks. So we'll kick things off by giving each of the panelists a few minutes to provide some opening thoughts, and then move into a moderated Q&A for about 25 minutes or so, and then we will open things up for audience questions. So if, as folks are watching along, please do send in questions via the Q&A function. It's never too soon to get those in. I'll monitor them and pose the questions to the panelists. With all of that said, why don't we go in alphabetical order by last name, keep this very formal as we like them to be, and I will turn over to Mr. Chia Lim to kick things off.
Hi, good morning all in DC, and good afternoon and evening to the rest. I'm really excited actually to join in this CyberNext panel to share more about Singapore, our perspective, and what we are doing about IoT. So perhaps a little about Singapore in the context of the global digital revolution. Well, globally over the decade, we are witnessing what is termed the great digital convergence, starting with the convergence of computer and digital technologies, and increasingly the fusions of information's operational and consumer technologies into what we term as Internet of Things. And along with this, actually we are seeing that in Singapore, we actually have embarked on the next phase of our social and economic development with Smart Nation as our vision for the future. And Smart Nation is about transforming technology, about applying technology to solve real-world problems, and that will make a difference to people's life and across the whole of society. So here we are talking about creating opportunities, bridges communities, and offers a better quality of life that can be enjoyed by all. And as a Smart Nation, we aim to be a leading economy powered by digital innovations and a world-class city with a government that gives our citizens the best home possible and responds to their different and changing needs. And we are eagerly pursuing a spectrum of smart initiatives, as you can see on the slide earlier on. There are many smart ideas, and we are trying to become one Smart Nation. And along with this, we are seeing a surge in the proliferation of consumer IoT devices. And of course, we heard about the number of IoTs being predicted to reach 75 million by 2025. And in Singapore, with a good infrastructure and a home broadband penetration rate of more than 93%, we are actually witnessing a multifold increase in the number of IoT per household. And this is especially of concern as most of the IoT devices deployed are of little and or no security measures, given the nature of the emerging technology. Because of this concern and given its transboundary nature, we have been working to actually galvanize global communities to build a secure and trusted IoT ecosystem. And as part of this effort, we have just launched our cybersecurity labeling scheme in October during the Singapore International Cyber Week. Well, rather than I take you through what is our cybersecurity labeling scheme, perhaps let's sit back and watch a short video on the scheme. Dustin, please.
Singapore is embracing digitalization and is advancing towards it with Smart Nation as the vision for our future. Over the years, Internet of Things devices have seen an exponential growth and global proliferation. But generally, IoTs have poor security, presenting themselves as easy targets for cyber criminals to take control of the device, compromise data security and privacy, and launch cyber attacks just like the Mirai botnet attack that left key global Internet services inaccessible for hours. To improve IoT security and raise overall cyber hygiene levels, the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore has launched the Cybersecurity Labeling Scheme. The CLS is the first scheme in Asia Pacific that seeks to provide greater transparency in the security of IoT devices using a 4-level rating label. The label allows consumers to discern the level of security offered by the product and imbues security consciousness when making purchases. The label can help manufacturers differentiate their products in the market and incentivize them to develop more secure products while reducing the cost of compliance across nations through mutual recognition. The Cybersecurity Labeling Scheme has 4 progressive rating levels. Level 1, meeting basic security requirements. Level 2, adherence to the principles of security by design. Level 3, absence of known common software vulnerabilities. And Level 4, resistance against common cyber attacks. With CLS, we aim to raise cybersecurity hygiene, incentivize developers to produce more secure products, and build a more trusted and secure cyberspace for everyone.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that introduction, Chia. And I think we'll turn things over now to Kat to give us a couple of minutes overview of the US perspective on this. Kat, I don't think we can hear you at the moment.
Mute would help. Can you hear me
There we
now?
go. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, great. I will get this one day before we all return to working in the office full time. So before jumping into, giving a little bit of background on the program, I'm with NIST. For those of you who may not be familiar, we are the Institute of Standards and Technology in the Department of Commerce. We are non-regulatory. Our work is rooted in working very closely with stakeholders and developing guidance that's voluntary. I work for the IT laboratories, and within IT laboratories, our stated purpose is to cultivate trust in IT. And that's a lot of the background and purpose and catalyzation for a lot of our work in IoT. I do want to mention when it comes to FISMA and federal agencies, We do have a role there around cybersecurity and providing guidance to federal agencies that through the FISMA Act, as well as an OMB memo, is a requirement for federal agencies. But outside of that work, we work very closely with industry, and we take great pride in our work being adopted and voluntary. So we stood up the program about 4 years ago at NIST, and we started out by first listening to stakeholders. What should we be doing that we are not doing, and what can we do to help? And the resounding feedback was, there's so much good guidance already. Can we build on what's out there already? And can we view this as an evolution rather than a revolution and throw everything out? So what we did is we started by looking at things like the cybersecurity framework, the NIST RMS, and we looked at areas that we'd had a lot of success in NIST, and we rooted our principles that until today we feel those principles hold valid. One, anything we do needs to be risk-based and must be developed with risk in view. The other is our work is always outcome-based. We feel that to be meaningful and to be able to keep up with the adoption and rapid pace of technology, we really need to stay at the outcome-based level. We recognize one size doesn't fit all, and we also recognize it's an ecosystem of things. And while there is a lot of talk about devices and the security of devices, these devices don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in an environment and an ecosystem, and there's a role in all of the ecosystem for security of the Internet of Things. So to fast forward, how we ended up to where we are today, we started out by looking at the cybersecurity framework and the RMS and identified areas where IoT was potentially different and would actually introduce different risks and have to be addressed differently. And we published that in NIST IR 8228 as a guide for organizations that are using the cybersecurity framework or the RMS to understand where they should be focusing on and perhaps changing the way they mitigate their risks. And the takeaway was that in some areas, while there's a shared and a clear shared responsibility across the ecosystem for security, there were some areas where the manufacturers of IoT devices could benefit from understanding what was the expectations of some of these organizations or customers of these IoT devices, and helping clarify where is the organization potentially dependent on something that the IoT device manufacturer offers. And this is how we went down this path of identifying a core baseline. We call it the IoT cybersecurity core baseline. Wanting to start first by looking broad. We listened to stakeholders. One of the key concerns of our stakeholders was, can we try to avoid, where possible, fragmentation? As an IoT device manufacturer, I serve many markets, both domestic as well as international. How can we mitigate this concept of having differing requirements across all my different markets? So we started by saying, okay, where's a core baseline? Where can we all somewhat agree? These are, in our case, the 6 key elements that we think any IoT device should be able to support. We started out by looking broad. We looked domestic, we looked international, and we worked over a year with stakeholders. We had 2 public comment periods. We incorporated 600 public comments into what is now known as NIST IR 8259, which is our core baseline. And that was published earlier this year in June. And, trying to eat our own dog food now, we are starting out with that core baseline, and we are adapting that to the federal government. So that's our current work. We have a program website. We have lots of upcoming work as well on confidence mechanisms. I'm sure we'll talk about it through today's panel. So thank you, Alex.
Brilliant. I'm seeing, thanks for that, Kat. And I'm seeing Andreas is on, but I don't see his webcam. Andreas, are you able to hear us? There we go.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Thank you, Alexander. I'm going to share my screen for a moment. I suppose, actually, I'm not supposed to do that. All right. Sorry about that. I have a bunch of slides. I could share them if it were to be possible. Anyway,
it was just enabled, so you should be able to share
is
now.
it? Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. So here I go.
The wonders of technology.
Who would ever have thought of that? All right. Could you actually see my screen now, or am I sharing?
You're not, no. So
No.
if you hit share screen and then click your screen and then hit the blue share button in the bottom right corner.
Yeah,
there you go.
One more. All right. I just had one more click to make. So here I am. So good afternoon, everyone. It's evening over here in Athens, East European time zone. My name is Andreas Mitrakas. I work for the EU Cybersecurity Agency, known by the acronym ENISA. The acronym does not represent the current keywords of the agency on the agency's name. I have just a small set of slides for you, just to highlight some of the assertions of the key instruments we have at our disposal in order to carry out policy support work in the EU. This instrument is called the EU Cybersecurity Act. It was adopted in June. Actually, it came into effect in June last year. So it's been in force for approximately a year and a half. And a lot has gone under the bridge since then. A lot has happened in terms of activities. Now, a key point here is to highlight that this legal instrument foresees a framework for cybersecurity certification in the EU. So this is a legislative instrument. So the European Commission and all the member states can ask ENISA to draft cybersecurity certification scheme on policy areas of their interests. ENISA, working with experts and under close collaboration with member states, representatives, it produces a scheme which, provided it is adopted, becomes part of European law. So for a small stakeholders-oriented agency that did not quite have much to regulate for about 15 years, this is important business. Of course, ENISA gets to do all sorts of policy support tasks and assist in different governance functions, but this is not quite so important for our discussion. Importantly, we're looking into working very closely with the European standards organizations and the international standardization development organizations, ISO, IEC, ETSI, and Sensenelec in Europe, in order to bring forward the best of the latest of what happens at the standardization level, and make sure that security provisions and requirements for the purpose of conformity assessments are duly reflected and represented in the schemes that ENISA proposes. So here, what we had in mind is also to take into account complementarity across the different areas. It is, I think, fair to say that in the past almost 30 years, the example area, the paradigm has been set through the work around the Common Criteria Mutual Recognition Agreement. In Europe, it has been known as the SOG-IS, under the SOG-IS acronym, which essentially was an intergovernmental agreement across some European countries, but it never came under the EU treaty, so it was never part of EU law as such, until, of course, the advent of the Cybersecurity Act. So currently, ENISA is transitioning the Common Criteria scheme under, and just bringing it gradually under the EU treaty in the context of this act that we're talking about. And in parallel, we're also looking into cloud services, processing a request received for cybersecurity certification there. Of course, we are looking into an area where one can imagine that a device is certified under the common criteria requirements in the EU would also be used to a certain extent for cloud services that would also be based on EU provisions thereupon. So we're looking into a system, and gradually we'll move into verticals and other areas, including IoT for different purposes, as I can explain after the presentation further. So a lot of interesting activities, as you can imagine, lots of lines to draw and links to process. Now, with the two concentric circles here, what I want to say is that we have a full life cycle approach based on a union rolling work program, which feeds into, which lays out the provisions, what schemes Europe needs. That feeds into ENISA work, which is crystallized through the input of working group, ad hoc working groups, as they mentioned. Thereafter, provided there is member state voting in committee, these schemes become the law, EU law. And then we enter into 5-year maintenance phases, which are recurrent for each scheme. In ENISA, we wanted to, since of course we believe that we could even be smarter than the legislator, who could have ever thought of that, we thought that we can enhance this whole approach by proposing a risk-based methodology for the purpose of determining assurance level. So assuming you're vendor of a semiconductor product, for instance, by following a specific risk-based methodology that I will propose, then such vendor could determine the level of assurance that she needs to assign to a specific product, depending on the application, on the number of parameters, including the application environment, usages, and common risks, and this sort of thing. We also develop guidance, and we'll go to great lengths to provide guidance to conformity assessment bodies, vendors, manufacturers, consultants, public authorities, all our stakeholders in the different areas concerning each individual scheme. And of course, you can imagine that we have a very motivated team to help on that. Last slide, just wanted to bring to fore the relationship with the standards organization that I referred to before. We are also looking into stretching beyond the limits of collaboration with public interest standards organizations, and also include the private slash industry standardization to our bigger picture. So we're coming up with a strategy there too, but the message remains the same, that we're looking to standards with a critical eye, trying to identify gaps. Sometimes our stakeholders are kind enough to share such gaps with us, and we could convey that message further to the standards organization, or look into new areas where standardization is likely to be needed. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the QA session, Alexander. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks so much for that, Andreas. And we'll turn things over to Peter for a few minutes of remarks before we get into the Q&A. Peter.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you. I won't take up much of everyone's time. It's great to hear all the progress that's being taken around the world as well. So I won't have as much to say because there's already so many wonderful things happening. First thing, so my name is Peter Stevens, and it's my pleasure to lead the Secure by Design team. Fundamentally, my team exists to protect citizens' networks and infrastructure from the range of harms that can come from compromised consumer-connected devices. So that includes the IoT. And it's something that we take really seriously, and we've worked in partnership with the NCSC as well as with industry, academics, and people on this call, and people I'm sure in the panel, in the attending as well, who have been really helpful to us in terms of how can we try and take the steps we need to protect people. I think we fundamentally know that these devices are great and offer real health benefits. They can keep people connected, which I think is more important now than ever. and help reduce carbon footprints as well. And I think that fundamentally we do want to see this category of devices work. We want to see it succeed, and we think that consumer trust, as Kat mentioned before, is a really integral part of that. Sadly, we know right now that the poor practice is really letting the side down, and there's a lot of potential possibilities which can happen and can arise, and harms that can arise from these devices once compromised. Mirai is in the not too distant past, and also we know that there are other instances of other damage that can happen at individuals level or even at networks. So what we've done is we have worked in partnership with the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, and we have helped to try and codify what good practice looks like, seeking to try and support industry across a range of scales to implement good practice and make that publicly available. So we published that in 2018. As well as that, we've been really working with international standards bodies to try and develop standards that can help us to deliver on the feedback from those 13 outcome-led principles in the code of practice, which we're working closely with ETSI, and most notably on the development of ETSI TS 103645 and also EN 303645. As well as also engaging with other international standards fora as well, who have been really important for us to kind of gather feedback from industry and academics on our approach. And also just in parallel, we've also been thinking since we started this work, and given the industry response of it's all very well publishing codes of practice, but in order to do that, there was a need for regulatory teeth and a need for us to recognize our role in how can we not only socialize good practice, but also be prepared to set the most appropriate and pragmatic baseline for this broad spectrum of devices, which we know come from small startups all the way up to trillion-dollar tech companies. And so I think that we really have been thinking about that. So in 2019, we had a consultation on what could be the possibility of a regulatory approach, and we've continued that work over in 2020 as well. In 2020, this year, in June, July, we published a call for views on our proposed regulatory approach as well. So right now we're reviewing a lot of the feedback from that, and I see our approach in the future to be to try and think how quickly we can develop a regulatory approach that is appropriate and pragmatic, which gets the right balance in making sure that we make sure that appropriate information is transparent at the point at which these devices are purchased, without doing so in a way which will place a heavy burden so as to reduce the innovation and reduce the these exciting products, many of which already do embed good security. So fundamentally, I see my team as having two core ambitions. The first is to really socialize good practice and support all organizations to adopt it. I think that we've worked in closely with ETSI, as I've mentioned before, and it's really exciting to see the work that's going on in Singapore with their voluntary labeling scheme in particular. And I think also another area that we're working towards is how can we engage with industry associations and academics to gather feedback on our approach. We have also developed some training and made available for manufacturers and retailers of these devices to try and support them around what it means to embed good security practices, and also seeking to develop that low burden approach. Something that we've also done is support the development of assurance schemes, recognizing that above the baseline, we want to be able to support all organizations to always make their products as secure as they can be. So we have this year also supported the development of assurance schemes in the UK as well. And our second big approach is to deliver legislation as soon as possible. So this is something that I'm sure we can talk about in the coming questions. And yeah, lovely to meet you all, and I hope everyone is safe and well. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the opening remarks, folks. Let's hop on into the conversation, the Q&A portion of the conversation. First question that we had sort of discussed, and using this as a bit of a level set for talking through the difference in approaches. Peter then mentioned socializing good practices and driving adoption as one of the core objectives of the UK government's approach. I wonder if we can level set on what is the fundamental, excuse me, what is the fundamental challenge that governments are trying to address here? Is there a common challenge that everybody is working towards? I'll throw that over to Andreas first.
Alex, thank you. Big fingers, clumsy use of flat surfaces. I suppose the problem, as it's presented to policymakers, is it's a substantial one. It's of the size of 75 billion IoT devices by 2027, gazing upon us all, if we were to believe these gloomy forecasts. And now, of course, it's not so much about how many of those devices we'll have, or billions thereof, but what they will actually do. And there's an awful lot of things that they might. So I think it's quite fair that policymakers are concerned, and they're already taking up measures into responding to the challenge. Essentially, in the EU, I recall that back in March 2015, the European Commission ignited the Alliance for Internet of Things Innovation, trying to build an ecosystem around the concepts of IoT. They didn't stand still. Later on, they produced consecutive layers of policy guidance, including digitizing European industry initiative that was published in 2016. They looked into the ecosystem again, human-centered IoT approach, as you might expect in Europe, and single market, of course, because this is the key message of the European Union. As the most impactful policy area is the internal markets. So currently, we have moved to a situation that presents the internal market for data as the digital single market. That's the acronym to use, and it's a powerful notion because policy there looks into clearly the cross-border situation, interoperability at the applications level, liability issues, and it's seeking in general to master the complexity that inevitably emerges. Now, if we wanted to layer the problem, we could see that there's different policy initiatives directed towards, for instance, different layers thereof. So you have consumer protection sitting right at the heart of the EU response. And I recall that standard of ETSI EN 303-645 related to consumer IoT. That's a very new standard, approved by all standards organizations in the member states. So it reached a very high level very fast. Then there's activity around industrial systems, industrial control systems related to critical infrastructure and the implementation of the NIS directive. That's the Network Information Security Directive that looks into operators of critical services or essential services, critical infrastructure at large, just to keep it simpler. There's provisions for security and evaluation that could be taken into account. I could also reflect on the possibility of using the policy strand of electronic identification of individuals as a way to make a more dense net of provisions in relation to IoT, so that people indeed know who owns or controls what. For all these areas, I might not have precise replies because policy formation is in the making as we speak. But good news is that come December, the Commission will publish policy guidance further in some of these areas. So we expect to hear something about the Union's rolling work program on certification, which might be impactful in this area for us. But also we might just get more input in relation to electronic identification and to IoTs as it stands. Thank you.
So, but the fundamental policy challenge, as I understand it, there's kind of two buckets in here. One is the question around individual devices and their, the capacity for harm by them being corrupted. And then there's the broader ecosystem challenge of, even if the individual device itself not acting as it should doesn't impact the thing it should be controlling, it can impact other devices. And when we do that across, as you say, a universe of billions of devices, then that creates problems elsewhere in the system. When we look at those two problems, what sort of behavior are we hoping to see here from the various stakeholders, the manufacturers, the retailers, the users of devices? Chia, I wonder if you could jump in on that one.
Great, thanks. Andre, you want to say something?
No, I misunderstood the question. Sorry about
that. Apologies.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So for our CLS or the cybersecurity labeling scheme, for example, actually we designed it upfront actually to cover not just the user or the retailers or the manufacturers, but also among the international partners. So let me explain these few entities, and we call it an approach of C, D, and E. So for C, for consumers, when you said it, the user, currently, the cybersecurity provisions of IoT devices is pretty opaque for most. And the CLS actually aims to make such provisions transparent to the user by creating these 4 levels of cybersecurity. We hope to actually, and through that, we hope to make the cybersecurity provisions transparent and visible to the user, and in the process, educate and create the awareness, enhance the awareness of the cybersecurity risk in them, and we hope to change the consumer mindset and imbue in them a cybersecurity consciousness. So that actually to help them make informed choices when they make purchases of such IoT devices. And we have D, which is developers, and we classify these all in the basket, the manufacturers, retailers, all in the same basket. And we hope that through the changing attitude of the consumer, we hope that this will in turn incentivize the developers to develop more secure products. And with a cybersecurity labeling scheme, it will help the developers to differentiate their product from competition and attain a quality branding. And E, we call it for economy and ecosystem. And essentially, we want to garner like-minded partners to actually adopt and for mutual recognitions of such labeling scheme and standards, so to reduce duplicate testing, reduce the cost of compliance, and improve market access across the border, so as to actually grow the digital economy. So that's the kind of behaviors that actually we try to hope to achieve in not just the manufacturing retailers and user, but also actually to seek mutual recognitions among like-minded countries, so as to galvanize global communities to actually build a safe and a trusted IoT ecosystem.
Anything else folks wanted to add to that? Peter, Kat, Andreas? Or does that pretty well cover it?
I think from my side, the most what I would love to see more of is, I think fundamentally it's about normalizing the transparent sharing of information between the manufacturer, the retailer, and the consumer. And I think that I definitely agree with Sue about the idea about how can we make consumers aware of, so when they go and they make informed decisions. I think fundamentally consumers do value the security of their devices. I think the challenge that we've often found is that they overwhelmingly assume they already are safe simply because they're for sale. And I think that a challenge for us as policymakers is to try and help, select the appropriate, canaries of what are the right and appropriate measures through which they can use to differentiate appropriate levels of security that meet whatever product they're choosing to buy. So for me, it comes down to the importance of transparency.
Hey, Alex.
Yeah.
This is Kat. So we see it as, we've been working primarily lately looking at the industrial market, and I think this topic of transparency and choice may be different depending on whether you're looking at the consumer market or depending on whether you're looking at the industrial market. I think the mechanisms may be slightly different. We had a workshop on cybersecurity risk in consumer devices about 3-4 weeks ago. At this point, we'll be publishing the results of the workshop. But there was a lot of discussion around, and I'd be curious if there's been studies that have been done around how much can your average home consumer make the assessment and kind of understand what is the appropriate level of risk? How do I decide what is the appropriate level of security for a device given in that market? Whereas when you look at the industrial organizations' use of IoT devices, they have more resources available to them. They have the ability to apply more complex frameworks. So I think there's validity in talking about transparency as being key, and we're looking at areas such as SBOMs and how can we automate some of that process to provide that transparency. But when it comes to the consumer, I think that is an area that we are still looking to do additional research on in this. Thanks.
Yeah. I'd sort of add to that. I think it's a really important distinction to make, obviously, the sort of industrial use case versus the consumer use case. And I think certainly in the context of Singapore and the UK, what we're talking about is on the consumer side. There doesn't seem to be strong evidence that labeling is effective outside of the minds of those of us who are imagining these things up. It certainly seems intuitive. You reduce information asymmetry, provide information to a consumer. Nobody wants to be the result of a cybersecurity incident, so therefore they will respond to that behavior. In reality, I don't know that that's true in practice. Certainly, I know there have been studies that say it may not be true. I'm sure there are others out there that say that it is a valid hypothesis. We've also got issues around labeling saturation. You've got your Energy Star label, you've got your cybersecurity label, all these other things. How many of these is the consumer really going to invest time in looking at? When you get to online purchasing, to what extent does the consumer look beyond the first picture on there? They're probably looking at other things like online reviews, not certifications, and so on. Anyway, all of that to say, I wonder if we can transition into this discussion a bit more and hear from folks in the UK or Singapore. Why was labeling your preferred choice, and what information do you have to sort of support its utility? Maybe Peter, if we kick off with you.
So yeah, so in terms of the approach of labeling, so labeling was a proposed option that we shared in our 2019 consultation. I think that we recognise that there's always going to be a challenge about all the things you just mentioned, Alex, about how can we make sure that consumers are responding appropriately to the information presented in the label, and how can we make sure that also the additional requirements on industry to develop the label is worth it for the the additional security benefit that we get to consumers. And I suppose the feedback from our 2019 consultation showed that actually, rather than having a label with a tick to say that it met the sort of the baseline security requirements that we called out, which we should just be mandating the 3 outright. So what we kind of came to end up in terms of an approach, which I think about pragmatically, if we mandate the security requirement and we mandate that at the point of purchase, the manufacturer and the retailer have to be transparent with the consumer about the length of time for which that product will receive security updates, we're getting many of the benefits of having a label, but we're then not going to mandate the mechanism through which they present that information, which we thought was helpful in terms of trying to find the sort of low burden approach. And I think that, again, this is definitely, we feel as though in an ideal world, I think it would be awesome if organizations and manufacturers were starting to differentiate themselves with their security provisions and starting to sort of to use the length of time for which the device is supported for as a way to differentiate their product from their competitors. And I think that that's something that I would like to see more of, but that's how we ended up in terms of our relationship with the label. And I think, from our side, I'm very keen. I know that there's definite successes and definite benefits of having a label for particularly the manufacturers who already do the right thing. So I think there's definitely a bit of a balance that needs to be struck between the two. But sorry, Suna, over to you.
Yeah, so actually prior to introducing the cybersecurity labeling scheme, actually we conducted a consumer survey, and this gave us additional confidence before we push out this labeling scheme, because essentially the consumers are in a way already asking for it. Maybe let me highlight a few the statistics that was collected. For example, in Singapore there are 63% who actually preferred a device with a label over device without a label, and then there's 66% that actually find that this is important or very important actually to introduce a labeling scheme, and about 79% actually is willing to pay for a labeled device. In fact, this actually survey is actually quite similar to a more in-depth survey that was actually conducted in UK. But at the same time, I also like to perhaps highlight a few attributes that actually of our cybersecurity labeling scheme. First, actually, the scheme is not a static scheme. In fact, I mean, given that the threat landscape is dynamic and evolving and all that, and the baseline cannot afford actually to be static, and the labeling scheme allows kind of water to find its level, and for us to actually progressively actually nudge the market towards higher cybersecurity requirements based on the market interest, the acceptance and the readiness of the developer. So for different equipment, for example, I mean, they may have, for a start, they may have they may gravitate toward different level of cybersecurity, and at a different rate. So perhaps, light could be initially CLS level 1, and maybe for things that are more important, say routers, home routers, maybe CLS3. And over time, if they get saturated into level 4, then we can actually consider to zeroize and reset our requirement. And we see success in, say, the energy efficiency rating scheme in doing that. So we find that that's very useful. And actually, these also can be very specific to the devices. As I mentioned, certain device may warrant to attract a higher level of a label, and while other devices which are maybe less critical have a lower level of CLS, it may be acceptable. So actually, this allows us to strike a delicate balance between raising the cybersecurity hygiene while actually continue to encourage innovation and the advent of new products.
Just one point of clarification there on the statistics that you cited at the beginning, the 63%, 66, 69%. That was survey data that wasn't then going in and tracking consumer behavior on the back end. Is that correct? So this was sort of asked.
Sorry, say that again.
So this was asking consumers the question in a survey format: would you prefer something that had a label versus not, as opposed to tracking their behavior on whether it actually shifted consumer behavior? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, for a start, yes, correct. And I also like to highlight that our scheme is planned to be flexible. And if you notice that there are actually 4 levels, and it will be lightweight if you wish to, and it will be which is actually essentially a self-declaration system, which is referring to level 1 and 2, and it could be involving third-party independent assessment, and if that's what you sought, so that is in a way flexible, and because And in doing so, actually, the scheme is also cost-effective and consistent because of this flexibility. It allows the consumer, the user, and the manufacturers actually to choose the most cost-effective approach depending on the risk profile they are comfortable with. And yet, it is consistent as well, given that at the higher levels, tier 3 and 4, actually it involves third-party independent evaluations with oversight from actually a certification body. So this allows consistency in terms of test cases that is bespoke to each categories of equipment. And as I mentioned earlier on, I mean, it's robust because actually we deal with comprehensively the consumer, developers, and also aiming at the mutual recognition.
Andreas, did you want to jump in there?
Just a reflection. In my mind, it indeed makes sense to work at the consumer level. You need the visa of cybersecurity for easy visual prompts and recognition. But best would be just to follow, as it was mentioned before, nutrition labels pattern, meaning that it's not just the recognition of a determined level of, or predetermined level of assurance, but also some key information that could be conveyed to the consumer in relation to the products they have in their hands. It might be interesting if you have unaware and informed categories of consumers that need to be protected, like minors, like silver surfers, all sorts of categories of people that are not all that involved with technology. Then there's a different set of requirements for industrial systems. There indeed being able to dynamically determine the desired assurance level and take additional steps in order to meet industry, business, or regulatory requirements, I think would make good sense. So I think labeling there could work more closely with the needs of the public services, supervisory authorities and the like, or they could be as well as industry-led ones for the same purpose in order to convey such requirements to the stakeholder.
So I want to kind of push back on this piece before, in a second, we're going to transition over to the international piece and open up some of the audience questions because we're already up against time and we're probably going to run a few minutes over. But I do just want to drill down on that piece. Andreas mentioned nutrition labels. We've got a kind of different model with the Singaporean labels. We've got a different model with the UK labels. Do we have concrete evidence for each of these different proposals that it actually changes consumer behavior, or are we just assuming that because it works in the context of food or in the context of energy that suddenly consumer behavior is going to change in a cybersecurity context? That can be to anyone.
Well, that's something, of course, I think we will be monitoring very keenly. But perhaps I'd like just to add another aspect of the cybersecurity labeling scheme. That is actually, for a start, actually the scheme is voluntary. But actually, we are open to mandate the labeling scheme at a later stage. If we find it necessary to ensure that the consumer devices are labeled. In fact, this is already happening with actually home router, or we call it residential gateway. Because of its criticality, and actually we are leveraging on existing legislative power. Actually, we have worked with our telecoms a regulatory body to actually to align their mandatory technical specifications with our cybersecurity labeling scheme at level 1. So in 12 months' time, that's almost like by this time next year, all home routers sold in Singapore must meet the level 1 requirements.
Why don't we transition over into the international focus and some of the questions that have come in, because that's been quite a common theme on the Q&A session. So by and large, we're looking at a common problem. I think largely I'm hearing a lot of commonality in terms of what we want to drive in terms of behavior from the various stakeholders. And yet we've got individual countries putting forward slightly tweaked proposals, and we've got efforts in ISO and ETSI. And it seems like this is an awful lot to be tracking if you're a small company producing, 1 or 2 widget digits that you want to be able to sell globally. So I wonder if folks can speak to a little bit of the work that's being done to drive an internationally coordinated approach on this topic. And maybe I can throw that over to Kat and then Peter to kick off.
Thanks, Alex. Well, I'm going to talk about international standards. So I do think international standards is a good place for the conversation to start. I'm not sure that we can ever achieve complete harmonization, but I do think interoperability and using standards and international standards as a basis to base that interoperability on is a good place to start. Obviously as NIST, we do keep ongoing conversations, both bilateral and in other fora, trying to identify where we do have agreements. But what I do like about taking these conversations to an international standard space is it really allows all stakeholders to participate. We don't believe we have all the answers. That's why we engage so closely with the manufacturing community, because it's the manufacturers that will actually have to build the solutions at the end of the day. They'll have to support them. They have to be realistic. Understanding the complexity of requiring a manufacturer to support a device or commit to secure updates. There's complexities that go beyond that, and so having everyone at the table and being able to discuss those in an open forum, we think is the best way forward. No.
I'm inclined to agree.
Yeah.
Peter.
Yeah, no, and I agree with Kat, and I think that there's definitely a role for the international standards bodies, and I think that I can only say that the feedback that we've been gathering from the forum that we've been establishing has always been incredibly helpful to our work in terms of translating the code into implementable provisions. I think that something that I'm always struck by is there are given the broad spectrum of devices or that we can talk about within the IoT and how you can cut it, and whether it's we talked about vertical or horizontal approaches. There is always going to be, and given how fast it's moving, there's always going to be slightly updated and slightly tweaked. And I think that there isn't an easy answer in the back of the book. And I think that we have to be quite clear about, we can put by putting forward options for people to say this is what good looks like, and to make sure that is benefiting from robust feedback. That is a helpful step. And then I think also it's important for us to focus on the, as opposed to the grey areas of where inevitably there is always going to be some sense of disagreement. To clarify, there's always a great deal more that unites than there is that divides them. And I think that there is a great deal of agreement. There's a great deal of consensus of what, pragmatic steps we can take in the first instance, so as to move from, fundamentally where you've got quite a lot of devices which have got quite critical vulnerabilities, which really they shouldn't have right now, because it's well known that they carry things like default passwords, which we just know and shouldn't really be there. And I think that, by focusing on that, we can kind of get the low-hanging fruit in the first instance. And then over time, to Soon's point about the importance of monitoring and evaluation to see how it's being taken up by industry, how is manufacturers starting to, are we content with the level of risk and how much we want to, do we think that there is more of a need for us to kind of be adaptable in how we use our approach? And so I think that that's something that we have to do as an ongoing journey. But I think that definitely we should focus on where there is agreement and consensus in the first instance. And I think there's a lot to go on there.
And if I may, I certainly want to echo what Peter is saying, that actually there are more similarity than differences. And I think we should work together to harmonize these approaches or scheme so that we have actually more mutual recognitions and we can work together moving ahead. And for example, for Singapore, I think right from the start, actually we intended to adopt the best standard that's out there. And I like to give credit to DCMS UK, Peter's side, actually for engaging us on the 13 COPs that they initiated, which is eventually evolves to become the ETSI, which is the European Telecommunication Standards Institute's baseline requirements for consumer IoT, which Andre mentioned earlier on, the EN 303645. So really, we have the same starting point. And of course, all of us, we are aiming for the same end outcome as well, essentially is to improve IoT hygiene and to build a secure and trusted IoT ecosystem. So really, I think all roads lead to Rome. And so I think there are really a lot of common grounds for us to work together to actually galvanize the effort and move towards a secure and trusted IoT ecosystem globally.
And Andreas, obviously the effort that you're undertaking is specifically directed at this international harmonization or alignment. I think, ETSI, the ETSI standard has clearly been internationalized in that it exists in that body, but has been used by countries outside of the European Union as well. Both Australia and Singapore are examples of that. Do you envision whatever Europe decides to do in this space will be taken to international standard setting bodies, or work will be done to ensure that kind of mutual recognition or alignment?
Well, it would be great, but probably that belongs to the level of poetry. First we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin. Probably at the consumer level, there was a clear gap. So when the colleagues from the United Kingdom came up with the ETSI-led approach, they had something very concrete and clear in their minds. They were very correct. The timing was also maybe slightly delayed, but still not too much so. And I think that's why this standard worked out very fast and very much to the point, and it's very welcome. But when it comes down to industrial systems, I'm sorry, I have to be a killjoy there. We might just see that internal market priorities take precedence, and then public authorities might want to move into this area at different speeds. I think the motivation behind related to state interest, public interest, and so forth could be well explained. And I'm quite confident that along the lines of the model that the EU internal market has set, access to services and equipment will not be discriminated as it is. Essentially, what is at stake here is to have a significant amount of transparency and understanding of what happens with complex systems, rather than block, border, or lay up fences and layers of impediments to manufacturers and vendors and service providers. So there will be differences. If I could also say the magic word here, privacy and personal data protection, I would be even more of a killjoy, because then, of course, the European approach is quite strict, and we also have to live under the consequences of the recent Schrems II decision of the European Court of Justice that has conditioned yet further transatlantic personal data flows. But this is the complexity of the environment we have. As a lawyer, I'm very pleased that the amount of complexity is so high. What use would there be for lawyers if it weren't so?
Well, as someone who works within a law firm myself, I couldn't agree with you more on that front. But we are unfortunately at the end of our time. In fact, Ari was kind enough to let us run 10 minutes over our time. And I think there's an awful lot else that we could get into, but we will need to save that for another day. I did just want to echo that final point, because I know that our member companies who are sitting here today, it is of the utmost importance to them, and the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of SMEs that are integrated into those supply chains. This has the potential to be a huge technical barrier to trade issue if we don't get the coordination aspect of things right. But I know that you all know that, and want to thank you both for your time today and for what's been a really great discussion, and also for the huge amount of work that I know you're all respectively putting into tackling this issue. So many thanks to you, and I'll turn things back to Ari.
Thanks. Thanks to you, Alex. Thanks to the panelists. I'm glad we went a little over. We got a Leonard Cohen quote in there. That makes for a much better panel than any time, in my view. So I wanted to